You were never meant to hear this. The files were sealed for over 3 decades, buried beneath official lies, and guarded by men who made sure anyone who asked too many questions was silenced forever. But I am not here to protect you from it. I am here to drag you into it. To pull you down into the basement of an abandoned opera house in Pennsylvania, where in the autumn of 1891, the town of Millerville uncovered something so grotesque, so calculated, so deeply woven into the machinery of power, that even the word freak show feels like a sanitized mask. 17 performers, 17 souls chained in the dark, their flesh scarred with the signatures of control. They were not prisoners in the usual sense. No, they had already been declared dead, their death certificates filed years earlier in counties scattered across the state. Officially buried, legally erased, and yet here they were, breathing in chains, forced into a grotesque theater of obedience for audiences who never suspected the horror beneath the tent. Cornelius Veneer was the man the public saw, the ringmaster of Vandermeer's Cabinet of Wonders. Tall, commanding, a predator who understood spectacle as both entertainment and weapon. Children laughed beneath his striped tent. Men paid to gawk at deformity, at difference, at the human body twisted into an object of fascination. But what they saw on the stage was only the surface. The real performance was in the basement, where identity itself was broken down, remade, and shackled into submission. Understand this, the Cabinet of Wonders was not just a circus. It was an experiment in power, a test of how far human beings could be erased and rewritten under systematic control. They were drugged until their own memories dissolved, fed stories until they forgot their names, conditioned to believe that their families had buried them long ago. And when you strip a man of his past, when you convince him that he is already dead, then he no longer resists. He becomes pliable, a living puppet for the theater of power. The town would later pretend it hadn't seen. The authorities would claim ignorance, but corruption was the glue that held it all together. Police bought with cash, doctors inventing false papers, officials who smiled at the circus while their pockets filled with its blood money. It wasn't just one man's madness. It was a system, and that's what you need to see clearly. These stories are not accidents of history. They are demonstrations, prototypes, lessons in control, and tonight you're going to see just how deep the system was willing to go. The story you've been told about Millerville is a quaint one. A sleepy Pennsylvania town, half old world and half industry, cold dust on its hands and a church bell in its heart. That's the postcard. The reality was a place perfectly engineered for silence. Immigrants desperate for wages, widows trying to feed children, men broken by the mines. Nobody asked questions because questions cost jobs. Nobody looked too closely at the stranger who bought the old opera house in 1887 because he spent freely in the taverns and paid his taxes on time. This is how darkness works. It doesn't hide in shadows. It hides in plain sight, behind the kind of respectability you were taught to trust. Cornelius Veneer understood this with the precision of a scientist. He didn't just run a traveling freak show, he cultivated a pipeline. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, his partner and counterfeit physician, posed as a healer to the weak and unwanted. Free medical exams for the poor, special treatments for the deformed, the orphaned, the unclaimed. But his real expertise was not in medicine, it was in sedation. Laudanum, opium derivatives, a cocktail of chemicals designed to erase resistance, dull memory, and keep the human body pliant while the human will was slowly dismantled. Once taken, the victims were transported under cover of night to the Millerville Opera House basement. The rooms were already there. Small, windowless spaces built decades earlier for storage, now converted into cells. Veneer and Kellerman even created a system of pulleys and custom locks to ensure only they could release the chains. They told the captives they were dead, showed them forged papers, fake letters, even death notices printed in small-town gazettes. Imagine that. You wake up chained in darkness and a man hands you a letter saying your family buried you months ago. Do you see the power in that? Do you see the kind of psychological experiment they were running? Sheriff Josiah Cromwell, the law himself, was the final piece. He greased the system, filed the false reports, ensured no real investigation ever reached too far. He was paid $50 a month for silence, a fortune in 1891. This wasn't just crime. This was a living model of how a hierarchy can rewrite reality, how paper and uniforms can make murder invisible, how an entire town can become an accomplice through willful blindness. You were told this was about a circus. It wasn't. It was about proving that control is possible, that identity is disposable, that you can make a man believe he is no one at all. The first whispers of truth came not from lawmen, not from priests, but from a broken girl who refused to stay buried. Her name was Sarah, at least. That's what she remembered of it. When she stumbled barefoot into the office of the Millerville Gazette editor, Thomas Fairchild, she was more specter than woman. Malnourished, trembling, her words fractured, spilling out in fragments that seemed impossible. "They're still down there," she whispered. "In the dark, the chains are too heavy." Fairchild almost dismissed her as hysterical, another lost soul from the mines. But then she spoke with a clarity that froze his blood. She described the opera house basement in architectural detail. Rooms he knew existed, locks he'd seen, and names, real names, of the people trapped below, names that matched the very obituaries he himself had read in the county papers. Sarah claimed she had been dead for 3 years. That's what they told her, what the papers said, what the forged letters confirmed. Yet here she was, alive and clawing her way back to memory. The chains on her ankles had been her coffin, the drugs her burial soil. And when Fairchild pressed her, she revealed the detail that shattered all doubt. A ledger, kept in Veneer's private office, recording every acquisition like livestock. Names, dates, prices, where they came from, how much they cost. It was the language of commerce applied to human beings, disguised as entertainment. Fairchild, though rattled, understood what he held in his hands. This was not just a story. This was dynamite. But dynamite, when held too carelessly, explodes in the wrong hands. He knew Millerville's sheriff was no ally. New officials were profiting from the circus's shadow operations. To move against them openly was suicide. But silence meant complicity, and so he chose a third path: evidence. He would infiltrate the opera house with Sarah, document the truth, photograph the cells, steal the ledger, and put the story in front of the world before the local machine could bury it again. But what Fairchild didn't realize was that power has ears. Kellerman, the false doctor, had already noticed missing vials of chloroform and photographic chemicals. He knew someone was preparing to see what should remain unseen. That's when the emergency protocol was triggered, an unspoken agreement between Veneer, Kellerman, and Cromwell. If exposure threatened, there would be no evidence left to find, not even the performers. Fairchild thought he was sneaking into the dark. In reality, he was walking into a trap designed to erase not just the captives, but anyone who dared to speak their names aloud. The strike came without warning. One moment, Fairchild was capturing the hollow faces of the chained performers. The next, the entire building seemed to breathe with menace. Sarah felt it first. The shift in the air, the muffled footsteps above, the faint chemical sting of kerosene dripping through cracks in the floorboards. This was no abandoned ruin. This was a trap alive with intention. Then the light changed. A glow seeped through the boards, orange and violent, and the smell grew sharp. Flames licking kerosene trails laid deliberately around the opera house. The emergency protocol had been activated. The order was simple: destroy everything. Erase the captives, the evidence, the journalists, the scandal. Let fire be the historian, and let silence be the verdict. Fairchild's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. He and Sarah scrambled toward the stairs, but the exits had already been sealed. The opera house itself had become a coffin, a pyre for 17 chained souls. The captives began to stir, their drugged stupor giving way to panic as smoke filled the basement. Yen, the giant, let out a low, guttural moan that vibrated against the stone walls. Catherine sang, or tried to, her voice breaking into coughing fits as flames crawled closer. It was not just death that awaited them, but obliteration, a cleansing by fire so complete that no trace of their existence would remain. Fairchild's mind snapped into survival. He shouted to Sarah, who pulled him toward a side corridor she remembered. A rusted ventilation shaft, barely large enough for a child, offered a chance. But it was not escape for all. It was escape for one, maybe two. Around them, the performers looked on with hollow, resigned eyes. They had been broken so completely that even the fire could not awaken the will to resist. It was as if they had accepted the lie written on their false death certificates long ago. Sarah pushed Fairchild forward, her strength surprising. "Take the plates," she rasped. "The world has to see." She shoved the satchel of photographs into his hands, her eyes burning not with fear, but with fury. In that moment, Fairchild understood she did not see herself as alive. She had been dead too long, but the truth, if carried out, could live beyond her. The fire roared, the screams rose, and as Fairchild clawed through the narrow shaft, clutching the fragile proof of horrors unseen, he realized something devastating. The circus was never meant to entertain. It was meant to teach a lesson about control, about silence, about how easily human lives can be rewritten, and how quickly they can be erased. Fairchild and Sarah chose a night when the moon was swallowed by clouds, a night when shadows stretched long and watchful. The opera house, once the pride of Millerville, stood like a mausoleum in the dark, its tall windows boarded, its grand doors chained, its facade scarred by years of abandonment. But Sarah knew a way in. She had memorized every inch of the place, every hidden crack in its walls. Leading Fairchild to a narrow alley, she pushed aside a loosened shutter and slid inside, beckoning him after. The air within was suffocating. Damp stone mildew, and something fouler still, an odor that clung to the lungs. With a lantern half covered in cloth to mute its glow, they crept down a stairwell Sarah insisted led to the basement cells. Each step was a groan of rotted wood, each movement a betrayal in the silence. Fairchild clutched his camera like a lifeline, knowing that the glass plates in his satchel were more dangerous than bullets. At the foot of the stairs, the lantern revealed shapes. At first, he thought them statues, still, skeletal figures against the walls, but then one lifted its head, eyes sunken, mouth twitching. A sound escaped, dry as leaves, a plea, or perhaps just breath. Chains rattled. 17 souls forgotten by law and time were still alive, their bodies wasted, their identities carved away by years of captivity. Yen, the Bavarian giant, raised his shackled arm with effort, his once mighty frame now collapsing inward. Catherine, once a soprano of rare beauty, croaked a broken note, a fragment of a lullaby from a life long stolen. Others stirred weakly, some muttering names, some unable to speak at all. It was not just imprisonment. It was annihilation of self. Fairchild's fingers trembled as he worked the camera, each flash and exposure an act of defiance against the machine that sought to erase them. Proof. He had proof. Proof of what the Gazette's readers could never imagine. Proof that could shatter the silence. But Sarah froze suddenly, clutching his arm. "We're being watched," she whispered. Above them, faint but unmistakable, came the creak of boots along the rafters. Men had been waiting, not lawmen, not rescuers, but the architects of this hell. Veneer, Kellerman, Cromwell. They had prepared for exactly this moment. The opera house was no sanctuary. It was bait, and Fairchild had stepped into their snare. What he thought was the unveiling of truth was, in fact, the prelude to an erasure more absolute than death. The trap revealed itself slowly, like a curtain lifting on a stage designed for tragedy. Fairchild and Sarah heard it first. The faint drip of liquid from above. At first he thought it was rain sneaking through the rotted ceiling, but the smell told him otherwise. Kerosene. The rafters groaned with the weight of men moving carefully, their boots scraping in practiced rhythm, and then Sarah's face went pale. "They're not trying to scare us," she whispered. "They're cleansing it." A Fairchild's stomach turned to stone. He looked at the prisoners. Their hollow eyes reflect in the dim lantern light, their thin arms trembling against iron chains, and felt the horror of what was coming. These people, drugged and broken, were not being saved tonight. They were being sacrificed. A purge meant to erase them and anyone who knew they had ever lived. Fire was not an accident. It was policy. The first torch dropped, hissing as it ignited the kerosene-soaked boards. Flames bloomed with terrifying speed, climbing the walls, spreading like serpents of light. The captives stirred in confusion, some coughing, others crying out weakly. Yen tried to rise but collapsed under the weight of his shackles. Catherine began to sing through the smoke, her voice hoarse, cracking. A hymn or maybe just a lullaby, the sound of someone comforting herself in her final moments. Fairchild's instinct screamed at him to flee, but Sarah pulled him to the far wall. She remembered a ventilation shaft, narrow and rusted, one she had used during her desperate escape. It was barely wide enough for a child, but it was their only chance. Smoke thickened around them, each breath scorching their lungs. Fairchild clutched his satchel of glass plates to his chest. Proof. This was all that mattered now. Sarah pushed him toward the shaft, her strength fierce and final. "Take them out," she demanded. "The world has to see." Fairchild shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief, but Sarah's resolve was unshakable. She had lived too long in the grave to imagine another life. Her place was with those still chained, not with the man who had stumbled into their nightmare. He crawled into the shaft, the iron biting into his shoulders, the heat chasing him forward. Behind him, the fire roared like a beast awakening, and the sound of screams mingled with collapsing beams. The opera house, once the jewel of Millerville, was becoming a furnace of secrets. And as Fairchild dragged himself into the night, smoke curling around his head, he knew the flames were not meant to consume wood or stone. They were meant to consume memory itself. Fairchild tumbled out of the ventilation shaft into the cold night air, coughing until his throat tore raw. He staggered to his feet, clutching the satchel of fragile glass plates as if it were his very heart. Behind him, the opera house writhed in fire. Flames leapt skyward, painting Millerville's skyline with a violent glow. Screams carried on the wind, thin and pitiful, swallowed quickly by the roar of burning timber. He wanted to run back, to tear down the boards, to drag them all into the street. But the moment he turned, he saw shadows. Figures were already circling the inferno, men who did not shout in alarm or rush to help. They stood at measured distances, torches in hand, their faces pale with the reflection of their own crime. And among them stood Cromwell himself, watching the blaze with the serenity of a man attending a sermon. His lips moved faintly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in satisfaction. Beside him, Kellerman barked orders to ensure no one approached. This was not chaos. This was choreography. Fairchild's instincts told him to hide. He ducked behind a cart, pressing the satchel close, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. The fire was no accident. It was the erasure of history, carried out in plain sight. Tomorrow's newspaper headlines would call it tragedy. A lantern left unattended, a squatter's careless spark, and the townsfolk, eager to avoid the weight of horror, would accept the lie. Through the smoke and the crowd, Fairchild spotted Sarah once more, framed in the blazing doorway of the opera house. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood upright, her face lit by fire, her chains visible even from where he hid. For one haunting moment, Her eyes locked with his across the distance. There was no plea in them, only command. Carry it forward. Then the roof collapsed, and she was gone. Fairchild fled into the dark alleys, his lungs burning, his mind unraveling. He had proof. Proof etched on fragile glass that the world could not so easily deny. But already he feared how quickly power could twist truth into myth. He was a single man with a satchel of evidence against a network of men who had silenced dozens. He wondered if he could truly win, or if, in time, the photographs themselves would vanish, just as the performers had. The fire was not an ending. It was the opening act of a far larger cover-up. Fairchild reached his office at the Millerville Gazette just before dawn, his clothes soaked in smoke, his hands blistered, his mind torn between terror and urgency. He locked the door behind him and laid the satchel on his desk, as if it were holy relics. The glass plates rattled softly inside, delicate as the truth they carried. He knew he had to move quickly. By the time the ashes cooled, the official story would already be written. If he hesitated, his voice would be drowned beneath the machinery of lies. He developed the first plate in a shallow tray, his hands trembling as the image bled into existence. Shadows gave way to shape, faces, gaunt and hollow, chains glinting in the lantern light. Proof, not rumor, not hysteria, but undeniable evidence. He wept as he watched the figures emerge, each one a testimony carved in silver and smoke. Sarah had given her life for this. He could not let it die on his desk. But before he could prepare the next plate, there was a knock at the door, too sharp, too deliberate. Fairchild froze. It was barely past dawn. No one should have known he was here. He extinguished the lamp, heart pounding in the dark. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a voice. Calm, familiar. Sheriff Dalton, or Mr. Fairchild. The sheriff drawled. You got something in there that belongs to folks higher than you. Why don't you open up and hand it over? Fairchild's stomach clenched. The sheriff was no lawman in this matter. He was their clean-up man, and he was not alone. Heavy boots scuffed the street outside, the measured steps of deputies loyal not to justice, but to Cromwell's purse. The Gazette's thin wooden walls would not keep them out for long. In desperation, Fairchild packed the plates back into the satchel and pried open the office's rear window. He slipped into the alley as quietly as he could, the glass clinking against his ribs. Behind him, the sheriff's voice grew harder, angrier. You think you can fight this? You think anyone's gonna print what you got? They'll call you mad. They'll call you a liar. You'll vanish like the rest of them. The Fairchild did not look back. He vanished into the morning haze, clutching his fragile burden. He had no allies left in Millerville. If the truth was to live, he would have to carry it beyond the town, beyond the reach of the men who had lit the fire. But with every step he took, he felt the weight of their eyes, already hunting, already rewriting. The question was no longer whether he could reveal the truth. The question was how long he could survive holding it. Fairchild rode out of Millerville. Before the sun fully breached the horizon, his horse lathered with sweat, the satchel bouncing against his side with every jolt. The further he traveled, the clearer his thoughts became. If the Gazette could not be trusted, perhaps larger papers beyond the county could. Philadelphia, New York, places where Cromwell's reach would falter, where the truth might pierce through the fog of silence. He rehearsed in his mind the words he would write, the images he would present. His story was not just news. It was indictment, testimony, revelation. It could burn away the lies as surely as fire had consumed the opera house. By dusk, he reached a small town along the railway and rented a narrow room above a tavern. He worked feverishly through the night, developing the remaining plates in a wash basin, drying them against the cracked plaster walls. Each image was worse than the last. Skeletal figures slumped against stone, chains embedded in flesh, eyes staring with the hollow vacancy of souls already buried. One photograph caught Sarah herself, half-shadowed, pointing toward the rows of prisoners. It felt as though she were looking directly at him even now, commanding him onward. He wrapped the prints in oilcloth and prepared a manuscript, his words raw but urgent. The next morning, he approached the telegraph office, intent on wiring ahead to the New York Herald. But the operator, a wary man with a too eager smile, stiffened at his request. "You're Fairchild, aren't you?" the man asked softly. "Word's already out you've been spreading falsehoods about good men in Millerville. You ought to be careful who you talk to." The wires, it seemed, were not his allies. Messages could be intercepted, names carried. He was not moving faster than the network. He was walking straight through its web. That night, he returned to his rented room only to find the door ajar. The lock splintered. The wash basin lay overturned. His prints scattered and trampled. 3 plates were shattered into glittering shards across the floor. On the desk, scrawled in black ink, was a message that made his blood run cold. Stories burn easier than buildings. A Fairchild gathered the surviving plates with shaking hands. They had found him already. Millerville's fire had reached beyond its borders, carried not by flame but by influence, wealth, and fear. He was no longer a reporter chasing a story. He was a fugitive carrying the last fragments of lives the world was meant to forget. Fairchild did not sleep that night. He sat in the corner of the small room, revolver in one hand, the wrapped bundle of photographs in the other. Every creak of the tavern floorboards below, every drunken shout from the street outside, felt like the beginning of his end. He knew now that he was not merely being watched. He was being hunted. And yet, amidst the fear, a sharper thought pressed against his skull. The plates were more than evidence. They were the only gravestone those 17 souls would ever have. If they were destroyed, their lives would vanish as though they had never existed at all. By dawn, he had a plan. He would smuggle the photographs to Philadelphia, using an old printer he once knew, a man named Elias Turner, who had printed abolitionist papers in the years before the war. Turner was stubborn, honest, and had risked his own life more than once to expose the powerful. If anyone would help, it would be him. Fairchild wrapped the plates in thick cloth, bound them in a crate marked as medical supplies, and bought a ticket for the morning train east. But the railway station was crawling with deputies. Not in uniform, not overtly, but their eyes followed him. Their boots scraped the floor in rhythm. Their hands lingered too long near their belts. Kellerman's network had already spread this far. Fairchild boarded the train with his heart pounding, keeping the crate close to his feet, his mind racing with every possibility of betrayal. The first hour passed in tense silence. He dared not look anyone in the eye, dared not move from his seat. But when the train slowed at a minor stop, 2 men in dust-stained coats entered his carriage. Their gaze swept the rows of passengers, cold and deliberate. One of them carried a folded newspaper beneath his arm. Fairchild caught the headline as they passed: Millerville Opera House destroyed in accidental blaze. Squatters perish. His stomach churned. The story was already sealed, the narrative already buried. He was a ghost chasing a truth that had already been pronounced dead. The men drew closer. Fairchild gripped the crate tighter, sweat slicking his palms. He realized with sudden clarity that this was no longer just about publishing the truth. It was about surviving long enough to place it in the right hands, and survival on this train might demand a choice he had never considered: violence. The train lurched as it gathered speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels echoing like a countdown. Fairchild sat rigid, the crate pressed against his legs, his revolver hidden inside his coat. The 2 men in dust-stained coats moved slowly down the aisle, scanning every passenger with the precision of hunters checking traps. One was tall and thin, his eyes pale and calculating. The other broad-shouldered, his jaw clenched tight as if carved from stone. They didn't look like ordinary deputies. They looked like men who killed without hesitation. Fairchild's heart hammered. He knew if they reached him, if they asked even one question, the crate would be searched, and the truth would vanish into splinters. He glanced toward the carriage door. Outside, the world blurred past, fields, fences, empty stretches of autumn land. Escape was possible, but it meant jumping into uncertainty with fragile plates strapped to his chest. The tall man's gaze swept over him once, then returned, their eyes locked. Recognition flashed like lightning. The man murmured something to his companion, and together they began walking toward him. Passengers shrank back, sensing the current of danger but pretending, as people often do, that nothing was happening. Fairchild's hand tightened on the revolver. Every step the men took was a nail driven deeper into his coffin. When they were 3 rows away, Fairchild acted. He shoved the crate under his coat, sprang to his feet, and fired a single shot into the carriage ceiling. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap of defiance. Panic erupted, screams, bodies diving for cover, the shriek of metal as the train bucked. Fairchild darted down the aisle, shoving past passengers, his satchel slamming against his ribs. The 2 men shouted, one drawing his own weapon, bullets sparking off the iron frame. Fairchild didn't hesitate. He kicked open the rear door of the carriage, the rushing wind howling in his ears. For a split second, he stood at the threshold, the countryside streaming by in a blur of gray and gold. Behind him, the killers advanced, their boots pounding closer. He clutched the crate tighter and hurled himself into the void. The impact was brutal. He crashed into tall grass and rolled, the crate striking hard against the ground. Plates inside shattered. He could hear the sickening crack of glass. Pain tore through his body, but he forced himself up, clutching what remained. Above, the train thundered away, carrying his pursuers into the distance. For now, Fairchild limped into the tree line, breath ragged, blood in his mouth. He had survived. But he knew the chase was only beginning, and his evidence was more fragile than ever. The forest swallowed him whole, branches clawing at his coat as he staggered deeper into the undergrowth. His chest burned, every breath jagged, but he refused to stop. The crate felt heavier now, as if the broken glass inside carried the weight of every soul chained. Beneath that opera house, he found a hollow beneath a rotting oak, dropped to his knees, and pried the lid open with trembling fingers. The sight nearly broke him. 3 plates were shattered beyond recognition, jagged shards glinting like dead eyes. A 4th was cracked through the center, the image distorted and useless. But 2 remained intact. Fairchild's heart surged as he held them to the pale moonlight filtering through the branches. Ghostly figures emerged. Gaunt, hollow-eyed faces staring from the darkness of their cells. Shackles gleamed at their wrists. The horror was undeniable, etched forever into those fragile panes of silvered glass. Proof. But as he studied them, another realization chilled him. These images weren't just evidence. They were messages. The captives' faces seemed to plead across time, their eyes locking on his as though demanding more than exposure. They demanded freedom, vengeance, remembrance. Fairchild's throat tightened. He had thought himself a reporter chasing a story, but in that moment he understood. He was a custodian of the dead. If he failed, their suffering would vanish into silence, erased by the very men who had fed on their misery. Dawn began to bleed across the horizon. Fairchild wrapped the unbroken plates in his spare shirt and tucked them into his satchel. He knew the killers would circle back. They would find the broken crate, the blood on the grass, the trail he left in the soil. He had to keep moving, but exhaustion gnawed at him. His legs buckled as he stumbled toward the distant glow of a farmhouse. The farmer's wife gasped when she saw him collapse at the gate, but her husband, wary of strangers, hesitated. Fairchild forced the words out. Pennsylvania Opera House a chained 17 before darkness pulled him under. When he woke hours later, The farmer stood at his bedside, holding one of the plates up to the window. His hands shook. "Dear God," he whispered, this can't be real." A Fairchild grabbed his arm, eyes burning with desperation. "It is real, and they will kill anyone who knows." The farmer set the plate down slowly. Fear filled his face, but so did something else. A dangerous flicker of belief. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of wood smoke and boiled potatoes. A simple, grounding aroma that contrasted violently with the horror preserved in Fairchild's satchel. He sat at the table, his ribs wrapped in rough bandages, while the farmer paced the floorboards, the unbroken photograph plate trembling in his calloused hands. His wife, silent and pale, clutched a rosary at her chest, her lips moving in frantic whispers. "You don't understand," Fairchild rasped, his voice raw from pain. "Those people are still alive, at least they were. I saw them, shackled, drugged, broken, 17 souls buried in chains beneath that opera house." The farmer turned, his eyes darting toward the door, toward the fields where the horizon stretched empty and watchful. "And you think dragging this madness into my home won't bring hell down on us? Men like that sheriff, men with money and reach. They'll burn us alive to keep this quiet." Fairchild slammed his fist on the table, the sudden force rattling the cutlery. "They already are burning us alive!" Every town that ignores the missing, every official who pockets their silence, they are complicit. If you stay quiet, you're no different. Do you want your children to grow up in a country where men like Vandermeer decide who lives and who is erased? The words hung heavy. The farmer's wife finally spoke, her voice trembling but sharp. "As right, Thomas. If we turn him out, we'll carry the sin and the faces." She gestured toward the plate, her hand shaking. "I'll see them in my sleep until I die. God help us if we do nothing." The farmer's shoulders sagged. He set the plate gently on the table, staring at it as though it might breathe. "You said you're taking this to Harrisburg, to the state press." Fairchild nodded. "The photographs are truth no man can deny. If I can reach the capital, if I can get them printed, spread them beyond one town's reach." Then the machine collapses. Their silence breaks. A hard knock rattled the farmhouse door. All three froze. Fairchild's blood turned to ice. Another knock, firmer this time, followed by the creak of boots on the porch. The farmer snatched up his shotgun, his face carved in sudden terror. Through the crack of the shutters, Fairchild glimpsed a shape on horseback, a dark silhouette against the fading daylight. "They've found me," he whispered. And the farmhouse, once a sanctuary, shifted into a battlefield. The knock at the door came again, this time followed by a slow, deliberate voice. "Thomas, open up. We know he's in there." The farmer's wife clutched her rosary tighter, whispering frantic prayers, while Thomas gripped his shotgun, sweat beading on his brow. Fairchild's pulse roared in his ears. They had arrived sooner than he feared. Men from Vandermeer's circle, wolves hunting in daylight without fear of consequence. Fairchild dragged himself to his feet despite the pain tearing through his ribs. "Don't open that door," he hissed. "If you do, you sign your family's death warrant. They won't leave witnesses." The farmer's jaw worked, his eyes flicking between his wife and the door. He was a man torn between fear and duty. The voice outside grew sharper, almost mocking. "You think that newspaper man will save you? You think words on paper matter? He's already dead. Open this door, or your fields will burn before morning." The farmer's wife let out a strangled sob. Fairchild stepped forward, putting his hand on the farmer's arm, his voice low, commanding, "This is the test. This is the line. If you stand with them, you'll always be their slave. If you stand with me, you'll live with danger, but you'll also live with honor." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the farmhouse settling in the wind. Then the farmer raised the shotgun, cocked it, and whispered, "Go. Back door." through the orchard. I'll give you your chance. Fairchild grabbed the satchel, clutching the precious plates against his chest. As he limped toward the back door, the front door shuddered under a heavy boot. The farmer swung it open himself, shotgun leveled, filling the doorway with his defiance. Fairchild caught only fragments of what followed. The shouts, the shotgun's roar, the answering crack of pistols. But he didn't dare look back. He stumbled through the orchard, the smell of apples heavy in the night air, his vision swimming. Each step was agony, but the images of the chained faces burned hotter than pain. Behind him, the farmhouse erupted in chaos, glass shattering, wood splintering, the cries of battle swallowed by gunfire. Reaching the tree line, Fairchild collapsed against a trunk, gasping for breath. He knew he couldn't stop. The plates were all that mattered now. They had become relics, scripture carved in light and silver. His only weapon against a world that wanted forgetting. Somewhere behind him, the screams faded, silence followed, and Fairchild understood the cost of truth had only begun to unfold. Fairchild staggered through the woods until the trees blurred into a wall of shadow. His breath came in ragged bursts, every step dragging him closer to collapse. Yet the weight of the satchel kept him upright. Inside it, the fragile plates pulsed like a living heart, the only proof the dead could still speak. He reached a hollow near a stream, collapsing onto the damp earth, his body screaming for rest. For the first time since the farmhouse, the silence pressed in. Not the silence of peace, but the suffocating hush of a world too willing to forget. As dawn bled into the horizon, Fairchild forced himself up and washed his face in the stream. The water was icy sharp, but it cleared his mind. He thought of Thomas and his wife. Whether they still breathed, whether their sacrifice had been for nothing, the machine he was fighting did not merely kill bodies, it erased them, turning the living into rumors and the murdered into accidents. Vandermeer and Kellerman were not just men. They were cogs in something vast, something designed to consume dissent and leave no trace. By mid-morning, he stumbled upon a small village that seemed, at first glance, untouched by the corruption he had fled. Women hung laundry, children played in the dust, and an old man smoked his pipe on a porch. It looked safe, too safe. Fairchild's instincts told him appearances lied. He kept his satchel close, moving quietly through back alleys until he reached a church at the edge of town. Churches had once been sanctuaries. Perhaps, he thought, they still could be. Inside, he found the priest bent over a ledger. The man looked up, startled as Fairchild entered. "My son, you look half dead. What brings you here?" Fairchild's voice trembled but carried steel beneath, the truth and the fear of losing it. He unwrapped the corner of one plate, showing the image of a shackled performer, eyes hollow but alive. The priest's face drained of color, his hand tightening on the crucifix around his neck. "You shouldn't have brought this here." The priest whispered, "Do you know what you've done?" Fairchild leaned forward, his eyes fierce despite his exhaustion. "I've done what no one else would. I've given the dead a voice. But if men like you stay silent, their chains will stretch around us all." The church bells tolled above them, solemn and heavy, as if marking not the hour, but the choice.